Welcome, everyone. And you are connected to the third session of the C track of the day, the journey to enterprise data apps success. And today's session is being presented by Chris Bergh. He is the founder and CEO of DataKitchen. He has also co authored the DataOps Cookbook and the DataOps Manifesto and has spoken on data apps at many industry conferences. Before I give it to Chris, just a few housekeeping that should you have any questions for Chris, please post them in the Feedloop chat and I'll share it with Chris towards the end of the session. And as a reminder that if you are shy to ask questions in the chat, Chris will be available in the networking panel, and you could always find him on the networking session and continue those conversations there. So take it away, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. So let me share my screen and start my slides. So we're going to talk about this idea of data ops and what the journey is to get there. And so to do that, we're going to sort of talk through the idea of data ops as a concept and enterprise data ops transformation. And we're going to give you 6 steps to enterprise data ops transformation. And then talk through some examples of how other companies have done it. And so this term data ops is kind of on a roll. My company's been focused on it now for 7, 8 years. I've kind of been, I lived the pain starting in 2005 when I stopped being a software developer and manager and started doing what I thought was easier, data and analytics, which turned out to be a lot harder. And so, people are searching for it more. Gartner inquiries are more. It's moving up the hype cycle. And so it's, it's becoming more of a thing, which is great. However, there's a lot of confusion about it, right? There's different ways that people use data ops. Some people just equate it with software's DevOps, or some people say it's the application of Agile to data science and engineering. And there's other ops terms out there. There's model ops and ML ops and data gov ops, and people love to put the ops suffix on things to make it cool. And then finally, some vendors have kind of taken the data ops term and sort of put it on the software they wrote 10 years ago and said, this is data ops. And so what is it? And so if we think about kind of defining what data ops is, let's first talk about what the problem is that it solves. And so really the problem is analytic project failure. And I'm going to use the term analytic, meaning charts and graphs, or building data warehouses or lakes, or applying models and governance, kind of the full value chain in data and analytics. And I think we've all seen this graph, that a lot of projects fail. And I think one of the reasons that they fail is it's really hard to find out what your customers want. And a lot of companies default to taking months to find and deliver value. And that's too slow for the speed of business. And the other sort of failure mode is that a lot of companies are producing insight to their customers, maybe a dashboard, maybe a data set, and it has problems in it. It's late, it's wrong, the customer doesn't trust the data. And so we're sort of going too slow and delivering things with too many errors. And so the promise here is to focus on the processes that act on our data and how our teams work. And so if we think about what the concept of data ops is, it's really a set of technical practices and cultural norms and architecture patterns that focuses on 4 things. One is, how fast can you iterate? How fast can you experiment, get ideas from your team and put those into production in front of your customers? And how well you can do that with very low problems, errors, wrong data, things misconfigured. And how well your team can collaborate, either if they're sitting next to each other or they're part of different teams. And then finally, how analytic can you get about your analytic processing? And so what we talk about in data ops is really kind of focusing on 4 process cycles. Now, notice I'm not talking a lot about data here. I'm talking about the process that act on data. And so if you look at it, there's a process that goes through from, if you imagine the journey of source data to value, and maybe you do some data engineering, data science, and visualization, and you have your tool chain, it's Informatica or Airflow and SAS and Tableau. And what we want you to do is in DataOps is to run that like a Toyota factory. We want you to be able to produce Toyota Corollas and not AMC Pacers from the 1990s. And so, how did Toyota produce good cars, and how did they pass American Motors in the 80s? Well, they focused on the people and process. They focused on they didn't buy fancy robots. They focused on how they could run their system with low errors. And there's a whole bunch of management insight there. And then the second is how well you can change things. And so how well you can iterate, and can you tweak your model or your data engineering or data science quickly and continuously, and also do that in a way that doesn't actually break what you already have in production. And then the third process is really, how does your team work? How does one data engineer work with another person? How do you deal with self-service people using your data enablement platform? How does your data science team fit in? And so these processes, this collaboration, cycle time, error rates, and finally measurement are the areas, the processes that we focus on. And notice, I'm not really talking about what tool you use. You could use Snowflake, you could use Informatica, Tableau, Looker, AutoML tools, data prep tools. There are various tool chains, but we really are wanting to pull back from the idea of data and focus on the processes and the code that act upon the data. And that's really where the levers of DataOps success come from. And so companies, are interested in, right? And they say, okay, what's the real value? Why should I do it? And if you focus on error rates and cycle time and collaboration and measuring your process, what a lot of companies find is they're not actually doing very well. It takes them weeks or months to deploy new analytics, or they're doing it super quickly and they have a lot of errors. Or people are looking at their dashboards and they're having this sort of Friday afternoon chaos where 20 people are on a phone call finding out why the data broke. And there's sort of Hatfields and McCoys where the data science team and the self-service team and the IT team are all at odds. And no one really has a good grasp of how well the team is doing, how much work they're doing, what their customer satisfaction is. And I think the result of that is really that our teams are just a lot less productive, and they're spending too much time in meetings. You can see the job satisfaction levels of people who've gotten in the field are low. And as a result, a lot of our customers who are receiving the value are actually unhappy. And sometimes they go out to outside consultants, or sometimes they just don't listen to the data at all, and they follow their instincts. And so the promise of DataOps, like DevOps before it or lean manufacturing before that, is if you focus on that, you can actually do a couple things at the same time, that you can actually improve the speed at which you can take a model or a data transformation and get it into production. And you can run that production process where when you do that, it doesn't break things, and the data and artifacts created from the data are all perfect. And so that's a really challenge to a lot of people, because if you've been in the field for a while, you've got some vendor telling you, hey, you can go fast and not break things. And that's really true. And the best in breed organizations are actually able to do all these things together. And so and the result of that is you end up with lower cost and less unhappy customers. And so you can push this graphic equalizer up. It is possible. And that's where people start. They sort of to learn about DataOps. They believe in the promise. They believe in the analogy of the DevOps transformation and the lean transformation. They see how it's happening maybe in their digital organization. And so they, where they come in and talk to us is say, look, our customers aren't happy with us. We're not going fast enough. Things are breaking left and right. And our digital team is working on the website, does this DevOps stuff. And maybe our CIO says, let's be agile. So how do I do this with my data science and engineering team? And that's where it comes to the 6 steps to enterprise DataOps transformation. And so I think these apply to big teams and small. It's really targeted at bigger companies. And so let's say you're a big company, a big financial service company, and maybe you're broken into banking and high net worth and insurance, or you're a pharma company where you've got drug discovery and commercial and manufacturing and supporting functions, or just a multi-division company. And in general, these companies always have data and analytic teams that are aligned to the function. So insurance will have its own team and banking will have its own team. And they're kind of data and analytic teams, or they sort of work in silos. But let's say you're a chief data officer and you want to make a change on your team and you've read this data ops stuff and you kind of believe you can make it happen. How do you actually go ahead and get influence across the organization? How do you help people? Because we are talking about people here. We're not saying, hey, buy a new magic database and you'll suddenly get data ops. We're talking about how to get people to work better and work faster. And yeah, there's some technology that can help that. But how do you influence people to have that happen? And that's sort of the perspective of this. How does a leader in an organization influence other people to actually make this change? And so we've put together a 6-step process to help people. And I'm going to talk through these 6 steps, but in this slide, I'm going to give kind of an overview of what they are. And so the first step is really educate on the idea and possibilities of data ops. And so it's a term, like I said, there's a lot of different people out there saying different things about data ops, but what is it? How does it make sense? And what are the ideas behind it? And I'm a big believer that the principles of data ops are independent of how you actually do data ops, and trying to educate people on the principles and that it's actually possible to make these changes. And so, the second is, can you sort of get a group of people who are interested in data ops, maybe a community, and can you find sort of a first project to demonstrate some value? And I think this is in the spirit of Agile. Can you find a case where you can show something, a small project, maybe a greenfield, maybe not, but you can actually show that, hey, you can make changes to your data and analytics systems. You can deploy them quickly. You don't have to be a hero. It is a sustainable and high quality way of working. And once you have that, you can use that as a way, that pilot as a way to get other pilots and more interest, and use that, continue to iterate and expand. And then finally, how do you establish maybe a center of excellence or a dojo, a way to leverage those initial successes into a broad acceptance of these processes? And so we're going to talk through these steps. And so, the first question is like, all right, this data ops stuff seems interesting. How do I get executive sponsorship? How do I formulate a long-term strategy? How do I look at my organization and understand where they are in comparison to other companies, and what's a roadmap to implement it? And so let me answer some of those questions. So there's a lot of discussions out there, and we have actually spent a lot of time in the past. When we started to talk about data ops at conferences 5 or 6 years ago, no one really understood what we were saying. We wear chef's hats and give out wooden spoons, and people looked at us like we were kind of aliens. And so we've had to do at DataKitchen, we had to write a manifesto. We ended up taking blogging a lot and writing a book, and other people have started. So there's several other good books now on data ops out there. Harbinder Atwell's got one. There's other people who've talked about it, Gartner, Forrester, and Eckerson. So there is a lot of writing and concepts around what data ops is. And even if you Google data ops now, you'll find almost every day a new article or two written about it. And the other part is, how do you get your leadership to bought in that you need to do this? And I think the first part is just ask them the question: are they getting what they need? And I think the answer may not be great. You're going to find out that your business users aren't getting what they need, and that they may mistrust the data, or they may have found sort of a shadow layer of consultants and IT team doing the work. And I think that's one part. And then the other part is just like map the journey that it takes from source to value. And where have been the problems in that journey? If your business customers are finding a problem in their dashboard, that happens once every 2 or 3 weeks. Well, is it in the dashboard? Is it in the data, the transformations, the model, the infrastructure? And, look about how long it takes you to respond to those, how much work it is, how much time is being wasted because you found an error, a week after something's been live. And then look at your development process and how do your teams work together? How do you measure how much work is being done? How close and accurate are your development environments? And this is sort of trying to lay the groundwork and get some sort of facts on the ground on how your people process works in delivering data and analytics. And then the second is, I think, if you think about the strategic approach here, the first way we've seen is sort of build a strategy presentation. And partly adopting data ops means that you're going to adopt a short cycle time way of working, some type of agile model. And there's different flavors, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And then, is there a way that you could say, get a strategy presentation and then talk about an implementation presentation, sort of tactics and strategies on vendors and tools and sort of ideas of how you're going to do it. So, one way of doing this isn't other ways is sort of get a strategy presentation and then get sort of a tactics presentation as well. And another way to do it is to, and we've helped companies on this, is to provide a kind of an organizational roadmap on how you do it. And to do that, you've actually got to assess the maturity of your organization. And so we've developed a data ops maturity model that we've worked with a number of companies. It's been really quite interesting to do it. And you could talk about, and it really focuses on those sort of four things that we talked about at the beginning. What are your error rates? What are things late? Are they broken? What's your development cycle time? And how well is your team collaborating with each other, both in teams and across teams? And how much do you measure? Or can you measure your productivity and production? And then two things that are a bit more fuzzy: how well is your team agile, and what type of agile do they do? And just finally, what do your customers think? And so we've been able to do this and summarize the results. And one of the things that we try to do is use it as a way to provoke a discussion and not to shame and blame. And a lot of change in companies comes from finding fertile ground. And sometimes people see these initiatives as, oh, this is an opportunity that I'm going to get fired or get blamed for not doing something well. And really, it really is an innovation idea, not an opportunity to blame a team for doing something wrong. And so this sort of upfront work of trying to figure out how to sell data ops, how to benchmark data ops is a good way. But then once you start working and having sort of pilot projects, how do you find the first use case? And how do you actually get this thing going? And so to do that, you've got to start thinking about how your teams are organized. And so there's different ways that people have organized large organization agile groups. There's something called Scale Agile Framework, SAFe. There's the Spotify model of tribes and chapters and guilds. There's different ways. And then there's a role that's become somewhat popular and still new, the idea of a data product owner or product manager who acts as an interface between on what the customer needs and what your team can do. And so there's different organizational models. I think data ops can work in any of those frameworks, because in some ways data ops isn't about how you organize your team, but it's more about how you set up a technical environment that your team can use to be successful. So the other part is like, do I need, I get questions a lot about, well, what's my staffing model like? How do I do this work? And do I need to hire some data ops engineers? And I think maybe, I think of it in a different way. If you look at, in my experience over the past 30 years in software development, back when I managed software teams in 1999, I ran a 30 or 40 person software team, and we had one person on that team who was responsible for pushing our software to production in our early SaaS world. He was paid less than everyone else, and we used to just kind of throw the code over to him, and he had to deal with it. And what software realized is that, man, that process of moving things from development to production, the dev and ops process, is actually really important. And if you automate it, and if you make it smooth and seamless, you actually end up helping the whole team. And so the average software team now is almost 25% of the team is in some sort of DevOps role. And DevOps engineers are actually paid as well, if not better. And so I think of it as the idea is, think of 15% of your effort is in building the system that can make it easier for your team to iterate and innovate. And so that could be a person, or it could be shared among your data engineers and data scientists. And I think they really do have an opportunity to make a kind of a high value business impact. And even right now, if hiring in a software development organization having some of the best people want to work on DevOps. It's because it's a way that you can leverage your talent across the whole team. And building that system, building the factory, putting time and effort into it, that's one of the big challenges. And I think a lot of people think, I'm going to do it Thursday evening. It's, somebody's going to figure this out. But being intentional about building the factory and the system you work in is really one of the main ideas here in implementing a data ops plan, and staffing is helpful. And then so once you've done some pilots, you've got some success, the question is, how do I roll it out across the organization? And I think there's kind of two things. One is like, what is your data ops platform? How are you going to manage code? How are you going to test? How are you going to deploy? How are you going to manage development environments? And I think there's a set of technology, including my company, that can help. And then there's the organizational model. How are you going to get other parts of the company involved? And there's two patterns that I've seen there. One is kind of a COE, where people come in and they sort of act as a place where they can start getting wins in the organization. They sort of come in like combat troops and go and do the work and make it happen. And then a sort of a variant of the COE was a dojo, and it's more about people come in and they work, they train, and then they go out and make the changes on their own. And so both models can work, but I think thinking about how in a larger organization, how you make this happen. And there's and I would think this isn't something that should happen. Don't think of this as something that's going to happen in 3 days. This is in larger organizations, this could be a multi-month or a multi-year process. And the last thing I want to recommend is that you are able to think about how you measure the processes that your teams work on. And so we talked about production process. Can you measure the problems of your data providers, which one are good and bad? Can you measure how often you're meeting your SLAs or not meeting your SLAs? How recent your data is, how good your data is, how often you're meeting your build times. And these sort of, think of them like factory production metrics, raw materials, timing. They're really important. And especially if you have, like in some organizations, have hundreds of pipelines in production. Being able to see these production pipelines. And then the second part is the opposite. Your team is developing new pipelines. How are they getting into production? How well are they collaborating? How many tests they have? What test coverage? And so there's a set of metrics that you can develop. And I think this is really quite important to be able to look at and drive change, because I've worked with data people for a while, and even the most cynical ones will start to believe that you can go fast and not break things when they can see the data to back it up. And so gathering that data not only can help your team, help the non-believers on your team, but also help you as a leader look good, because you're able to show these metrics and show the kind of progress that you're making as a team. And there's lots of different ways to measure team productivity, and some of which come out of tools like Jira, some of which come out of tools like our software. But it's a very rich area that I think we're going to see a lot of work in the next few years. And so what are the keys to doing enterprise data ops transformation? So the first is, avoid the big bang, right? Start small, get a small team, show value, get customers talking about it, and kind of get the social proof, right? Don't ignore these soft things. How people, because a lot of people in data and analytics have been burned in the past. They have been, and I have the same thing. They have been yelled at by customers for being late or being wrong. They have been snickered at because they're too slow, and they've been rerouted because someone hired another person to do what they thought they should do. And so I think it's a very, there's a lot of scars on people who've done data and analytics, and this is changing the way they work. So being sensitive to that and trying to help people see this as an opportunity, not as a way to just yet another way to blame them for screwing up. And I think, like I said, one of the ways to do that is just measure the benefits and show that your team ends up being more productive, gets more story points, more feature points, more functions into the data. Track your error rates, that you have much less errors from quarter one to quarter two. And those things can be very concrete ways to show that you're actually making progress on these goals. And so in the last few minutes here, I just want to talk through some examples. And so I'm going to give a framework about how people have thought about this. And so, you're a leader at a big analytic company, you've heard this DataOps stuff, sounds cool. You've sort of done some maturity model, talking your organization, say, well, like, where can I start? I want to do like a concrete thing first. I want to be agile. I want to do an agile project. And so, but what's interesting, 4 or 5 years ago, when we were first pushing DataOps as a market, I would have made a bet that one of these areas would have popped as being a most important, lowering error rates in production, or decreasing cycle time, or improving collaboration or measurement. And it turns out from our customer perspective that, at least in the bottom 3, cycle time, error rates, and collaboration, customers broadly start in any one of the categories. And it's sort of, if you look at it, you could say, all right, there are different specific features that they want to implement. But maybe they're going to focus on errors, or they're going to do it just in the database and backend ETL team, or the data science team, or the BI team, or the governance. So think of it as a matrix. Where are you going to start? What team? And what tools are you going to focus on? And so here's one case where a customer has data that's coming from vehicles and going through a complex infrastructure. And they had too many of these sort of Friday afternoon long phone calls with 24 people finger pointing on that there's problems. And nobody wants that to happen. It takes a lot of time, ruins people's weekends, creates a lot of stress. And so they had a very cool infrastructure, a couple of ways to stream data in, batch things from things like SAP, models that ran. They had an Oracle data warehouse, notebooks and Tableau sitting on top, and the data customers on the right. And of course, they're moving to the cloud like everyone else. And the organization structure it's kind of funny. There's like streaming teams and IT teams and ETL teams. And so you can imagine something goes wrong. Well, where is it? Was it the source data? Was it happened during the streaming ingestion or the batch? Did somebody muck up an attribute of a dimension in the warehouse? Did somebody make a misconfiguration of the report? And no one quite knew where the problem was. And then they'd have to go and do queries and take time. And it's often the best people in the project. And meanwhile, the customer's kind of rolling their eyes saying, yeah, it's just teams are another screw up. And so how do you stop this? And so first thing, how do you find problems before your customer sees them? And the way to do that is not to replace everything that you have. It all works. So the way to do it is to put something on top of it, to observe the data, to grab bits of data, grab the bits of the artifacts that are created and check them. See if they're the right size, the right shape, they have the right numbers. And if something looks off, alert someone as soon as you can. Create a ticket, an email, a Slack message. And that way you can find out, is the problem on the ingest? Did my vehicles were producing 10,000 rows a day, and suddenly my vehicles started to produce 1,000 rows? That might be the source of it. Or is something happening in my configuration of my Tableau workbook? Did somebody change a calculated field and suddenly the data looks wrong in the dashboard? And so all these places are, I think of them, DataOps is misnamed in some ways. It's really not about the data. It's about the code and the tools acting upon the data. And yeah, the problems could be because the data is not showing up, but they equally could be because someone made some code changes that broke something that worked before. And so being able to check that and get those, know it before you get into production, I think is one key area where you can show value first with DataOps, get people started in this sort of system level thinking, and make your life sort of less miserable. And so believe me, I've had this. In previous jobs, I've had, thousands of people using the analytics and had it late and wrong. And there's just nothing worse than talking to your business customer and having them scream at you when there's data errors. It's not fun. And the only way I know to do it, there's no magic here, is test and observe and automate in production and send alerts. So the second case is, there's companies who've done a lot of work on their data. And maybe their data, they don't have a lot of external data sources. Their internal data sources are good. And challenge is like, how do you get stuff from development into production quicker? And some organizations literally are taking months to go from a development environment to a test environment to a production environment. And why does it take so long to take a change in the Informatica code, some new SQL, some Python model, and get it from dev into production? Well, I think because every time it's happened, people have invented some kind of human process, a meeting, a checklist, a manual step, and all to protect the work, protect the teams from problems. And the second is they kind of treat their environments like pets and not cattle. They're very fussy. They are specific, have specific code. They have their differences. Your development environment is different than your test environment, which is way different than your production environment. And one of the first things is just, can you abstract out the notion of an environment, test data, code, configuration, so that moving things from one place to the other is more of a button click than a set of manual problems. Now, that's good, being able to automate and abstract the environment, but really the proof in the pudding comes from taking tests and running a full set of tests, regression, functional, end-to-end unit tests in those environments. And a lot of data and analytic people, whether they want to or not, think of themselves with blinders on. I just do my little piece, and what comes after me, what comes before me, I don't have to worry about. And a lot of times, if you make a piece in the middle of it, you make a change in the middle of a system, you change a database table, you can't tell what the effect of it is on the model or on the visualization or on the governance. And so you need to sort of pull that pain forward and have it so that each one of your engineers, data engineer scientists, can see the effect of their changes. And that's what this graph is, these little numbers. See the tests and be able to regression and functional and end-to-end test in development, in fact, every development environment. And that what that means is it saves time, because even if you do manual testing or you even do unit testing, they're all sort of incomplete. And then if your environments aren't the same, you have to redo them. And so being able to pull the pain forward and automate your regression and system test based on an accurate set of test data that's reflective of production, I think is important. And those two things alone, just conceptually, can help you make your deployment time much faster, much easier, much less error prone. And so we've got a few minutes left, and I want to talk about another case here. And this is a case where people are interested in kind of the combination of cycle time and error rates, but it really comes from an architectural concern where they sort of have kind of a cloud and on-prem, or they've got two different groups kind of working in two different environments. And some people, they've built an on-prem environment with Teradata and Informatica. They've got a cloud in Azure or AWS. And in this case, it's a drug development. They've got a big Spark cluster, and then they've got an Azure team. And they're both very smart people. They want to share data, they want to work and together, but they've got two completely different tool chains. So what happens is these teams want to be able to work independently, do their data work, produce their insights, but the on-prem team wants to provide data to the cloud team. And then the cloud team wants to use it and provide insight to the analytic users. And so what happens if just you do a schema change? There's some drift between the schema or the data that happens in New Jersey and the results in California. And how do you monitor that? How do you check from that? And how do you just stop this conflict? And this is reminiscent of any group that is working independently but dependently. And so, one solution may be to sort of put the iron fist. Everyone's going to work for the same boss, and we're all going to work on the same platform, and that's going to solve everything. And first of all, I don't believe that happens. There's so much legacy code, and that the cost of upgrading it just never gets done. And so how do you deal with this conflict? I think the idea here is that you build a system that contains both of that. You'd be able to say, okay, you can work independently, have each term work independently, but build kind of a master system, a way to orchestrate all these teams. And think of it like sort of states' rights in the federal government. And I think that sort of can help you both run with less errors and also help you make changes faster. And this kind of multi-cloud, multi-team coordination is also where some people start out. And the last example I want to give is another case of coordination where people want to, where there's more of a bank that has kind of a central IT team, and all over the organization there are self-service teams. And think of it this way: bank's got a big customer list, customer data, transaction data, and different parts of the bank want to use it. Maybe there's small business in New York and high net worth in Texas and branch banking in Seattle. And they have different needs. The New York City team needs business data because and D&B files and a SQL database. The Texas customer, needs high net worth data, and the Seattle customer, wants a DDA stream and Power BI. And so there's different tools, different data sets. And what happens is when you support self-service users, if they go off the rails, then it's not the self-service team that gets blamed. It's a lot of times our central IT team. So how can you provision kind of self-service sandbox, kind of give them the tools and the data, and then pull it back if they start to do something wrong? And do that by monitor and check and make sure it's right. And I think that is, instead of being able to sort of build these sort of business-led development environments, self-service sandboxes for people to use, it's a good first step to help the central IT team get control. But and that's sort of reason enough to do a project like this. But the other part that goes with it is, well, these people who are doing work in the field, well, they've got good ideas and they want to continue to innovate and continue to find new ideas. They tend to be less interested in sort of day-to-day, day in and day out production. And so what is the path to production for your self-service users? How do you get that done so that it can be run with less errors and in a high quality way? And so the first is at the top, just there is no path to production. They did an experiment, it had a one-off use, it's done. You don't need to worry about it. And at the very bottom, there was a case where, hey, these people have done some good work. Maybe they did some Python code, maybe they built a segment in Tableau, really good stuff, really powerful. That could actually deserves and has earned the right to be re-implemented centrally as perhaps an attribute of a dimension or some kind of aggregate table that you put in the data warehouse or in a report that everyone sees. And that makes total sense. And then there's a third case where it should be in production, but maybe it's only useful to that team and you want to wrap their Tableau workbook, their Alteryx workbook, their Python code in a nice DataOps blanket with tests and deployment so that they can make it work. And I think all three of these, thinking pretty clearly about how your self-service users are going to get to production, I think is a lot of organizations are setting up data enablement teams or thinking about how the hub and spoke works and how the work in the spoke gets into some form of production, I think is an important task for teams to work on. And then lastly, so what's good look like and how well can you be done? And so here's a case of a product launch at a company we worked with, Celgene, and in a product launch for a brand that ended up being multiple $1 billion in sales, which is actually quite rare in pharma. They've got to integrate lots of different pharma data sets, hundreds of them, and they're all sort of lightly mastered. They need to be joined. And the data flows in daily, hourly, weekly, monthly. How do you actually get a highly integrated data set that sort of constantly changes? Because marketing and salespeople are demanding. They're always asking new questions. And how do you sort of set a system where you can make 100 schema or data changes a week, 100 of them, and do that with very, very, very few errors or missed times? And the answer is automation, lots of automated tasks, lots of automated deployments. And if you do that, you can actually end up having a very small team. This had 7 people do it, and they're smart people, but they're not, they're not geniuses, right? If you build a system, you can enable people to work in an incredibly fast and powerful and low error rate way with a very, very low total cost. And some organizations I've seen who support $1 billion, this had at the end sort of $8 or $10 billion in sales with 7 people. Some organizations have 200 people doing this work. And I think you can, it's crazy, but you can actually, by putting the time in and automating a lot of these manual processes, you save meetings, you save hassle, and you're building a system that does that work. And so that's really the all I have to say here is about. And we've got some services that can help you do this, both from a helping you transform and to work through. And also, of course, we've got some software that can do this. We have a DataOps software platform that can kind of help you lower error rates and decrease cycle time and collaboration. And so now we've got just 5 minutes left, and I wanted to see if there's any questions, but that's all I have today. I hope this was valuable for you. We tried to talk about the journey to transform your organization to do data ops. And so I'm just going to be quiet for a second and see if anyone's got any questions.
Great. Thank you again, Chris. That was very informative and chock full of resources from your DataKitchen. So far, there aren't any questions. They might be still absorbing the data, but I believe you did mention that you will be in the networking session following your talk here.
I will. I'll be there. Yeah, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me in the networking area or just reach out to datakitchen.io.
Oh, fabulous! I'll actually just put. I've been posting the chat. In the chat, the links to the DataOps Manifesto and the Data Kitchen Cookbook, but I put the main URL for people to contact you there as well. And to just remember for folks to go over to the networking, find Chris, and to continue those conversations and to ask Chris the questions directly. We may have a shy audience, perhaps.
Well, yeah, it's a long day, so appreciate the opportunity and thank you for listening.